Hello everyone, what's up y'all? This is Mike J with World News Report. Welcome back and thank you for joining us here to learn. In addition to the scriptures from the ancient Ethiopian Bible, we are also reading this book, Christ Was Not a Jew, which seems to parallel and prove quite very interesting indeed. As my disclaimer, I have no idea what it has to say, but I'm eager to dig in and find out. I'm sure that you are too. Additional note, two notes. If you noticed on my last post, we had an ant war. The ant war is over. Those pesky little house ants crawling across my book and everywhere else. We won. And also, I just went to the eye doctor, got some special prescription glasses and some eye drops. So reading is a little strange. It's almost like seeing things in out-of-body experience almost, but we'll see how it works, because this is my first time trying them out. So in our last reading, chapter number 2, part 3 of 3, we learned that Christianity came from Judaism, came not from Judaism, but in spite of it. How Pilate was framed and the mock trial run by the Supreme Court of Jews. So with that said, please join me in learning with reading number 6, chapter 3, part 1 of 3, Escape from Judaism. This ought to be interesting. The instruments. The escape of the new religion from the background of Judaism, as faced by the earliest Christians, was a task of no small magnitude. It were well for Christianity to be able to say that it was completely accomplished now. It was a task that developed upon such men as Peter, Paul, and the other disciples. Whether their ability was innate or was developed out of a contact that enabled and fitted them for it, we need not stop to consider. The point is, so far as personal qualities are concerned, that is, in the brief lifetime allowed them, they made the world eternally for their debtors to an extent beyond all praise. They were men specially chosen and qualified, but nevertheless, they were fallible men. There was a great deal of Saul that remained in Paul to the end in spite of his transformation. It could hardly be otherwise. Grave doctrinal differences arose among them which divided even Peter and Paul, but the Spirit of Christ prevailed over both in essentials to the unification of all believers. And in reverent obedience they submitted their difference to that leadership, so that it was Christ who led his own cause. These facts deserve emphasis in dealing with the escape from the background of Judaism, for the burden of that movement necessarily fell upon all of the early followers, and especially upon the apostles who were superintendent. These were the effective instruments, albeit they were fallible instruments, and it should give no offense to the modern believer when we speak of them in the character of fallible men rather than as defied saints, as many devout Christians now conceive of them. It is to be remembered that these were the ones whose faith must be strong enough to fulfill Christ's blessing upon those who, not having seen, yet have believed. The Greek instrumentality. This world little realizes the importance of the Greek influence in shaping the destiny of Christianity. It is not so much the influence of the Greek language itself, which was enormous, but into the non-submission of the early Greek Christians to the demands of the Judean Christians that they become Judaized before they could become Christians. So pervasive was the influence, not only throughout Galilee, but even Judea, Old Testament, translated in Alexandria, had to be rendered into the Greek for the benefit of the Jews themselves. Everywhere, the Hebrew language having become, at that time, all but obsolete. This is the version known as the Septuagint. Throughout the New Testament, one is conscious of avoidance of mention of the great race whose influence pervaded and dominated both the conquered Jews and the conquering Romans. Concerning the earliest spread of the message of Christ westward, the New Testament writers were characteristically silent with respect to the part played by the Greeks. But the results speak for themselves. If the message of Christ and Him crucified was to the Jews a stumbling block and to the Greeks foolishness, the Greeks were the first to make their recovery, as we shall later see. It is very significant that such a modern Jewish historians as Professor Gretz and Dr. Klausner distinguish broadly between the pagan Christians, Greeks, and the Judeo-Christians. It is also significant that while they hold the former responsible for the division between Christianity and Judaism, they freely admit that there was an amicable understanding between the Judeo-Christians and the writers of the Talmud. What concord hath Christ with Belial, or the Talmud writers? Summary of differences. Whatever may be the attitude of a Gentile, Christian or otherwise, towards the divinity of Christ, he will no doubt agree to the following. First, Christ showed his detachment from Judaism by his direct appeal to God as the Father in heaven. He did not, on his own account, appeal to the Jewish racial deity, no more than he did to Zeus or Jupiter. Second, the contrast between the message of Christ and the cult of Judaism was, so far as he was concerned, diametrical. But for those who brought up in Judaism, his attitude was one kindly and helpful tolerance. Third, Christ was not an enemy of Judaism or any other religion, except as light is to the enemy of darkness. He merely contented himself with showing a more excellent way. Fourth, Christ followed the customs of Judaism, the observance of Passover, for instance, for it was national as well as all religious. He taught in the synagogues also, for these were the town halls of the nation. Fifth, Christ was in the midst of Judaistic surroundings, even among his kindred and closest friends. He was never understood, not even at the Last Supper. Sixth, Christ, in his partnering instructions, did not tell his disciples to abandon Judaism. He told them to preach the gospel to all mankind, which amounted to the same thing, for it was an act of self-exclusion. This made it Gentile religion per se, namely a non-ethical, non-exclusive religion, humanitarian in its scope, therefore non-Jewish. One might suppose that the height and depth and breadth of the abyss that separated such a religion from its surroundings would have impressed his followers profoundly. But as a matter of fact, the perception of the great difference required time. It was the perception of this difference that was left by Christ to others who followed, for he contented himself with merely sowing the seed as the sole germinating power that lay beyond man's power. Those left behind must develop their capacity and worthiness. Hence, they must have plenty to do. And in all Consecration, we must add that the escape from Judaism remains to be completed, for Christianity still suffers from contamination with that primitive cult. It cannot be repeated too often that neither of the four Gospels was written till after Peter, Paul, and probably all of the earlier apostles and leaders had suffered martyrdom. And those who compiled the New Testament canon were not as detached from Judaism as were those apostles. Wow, very interesting. This new religion was broader than the measure of man's mind. The Greek race, with all its romantic galaxy of the gods, had never produced a universal religion. Their Olympic Games were a period of lustration, a religious revival, so to speak, in the civilized world at that time made use of the occasion as if it were a world's fair, as indeed it was. But the religion was Greek, and foreigners there assembled came with their own religion cults. The Jews likewise could never have originated a world religion, for theirs was a selfish and revengeful hava, devoid of a sense of fair play, as between man and man universally. How idle it is to think that Christianity, a world religion, could have sprung from the chosen people bigotry. Wow. Just a couple more pages on this part. Christ's methods were evolutionary, not revolutionary. He did not undertake to overthrow the whole system of Judaism, nor any other religion. But having sown the seed of reform, he left things to work out in the length of time needed. One might suppose that those who had walked with him from day to day would have been impatient to see his spiritual kingdom come upon earth, but they did not clearly distinguish between the temporal and the spiritual kingdom, and naturally they placed the emphasis on the former. The fetters of the past are not easily broken, and this ancient Jewish system has had its hold upon them. Its traditional sanctions of what was considered right, all reduced and accepted conventions, could not at once be thrown aside. Those conventions, if it is true, had strangled the life out of Judaism as Christ had so often shown. But the forms of a dead faith may continue to flourish independently of the extinct life that was once inhabited them. Indeed, those forms may be defended with all the greater zeal by those whose interests are imperiled, especially when they come in contact with a living faith and recognize therein a potent enemy. So it was with Judaism, and so it is today, for it thrives only by its antagonism to a living organism, Christianity, and when left to itself, isolated and alone, its real character as an empty racial cult devoid of a living faith is at once apparent. Whew. But why did Peter and the other apostles still cling to Judaism? They were Galilean Gentiles, and one might suppose that they would have been glad to escape the absurd formalities of an alien faith, remembering that Christ said, "I came that ye might have life, and that ye might have it more abundantly." No doubt Peter did remember, but why not introduce this new teaching into the old, thus revive the ancient forms? Again, Judaism offered a system, a body of beliefs and usages, traditions and usages, of which their lives were still a part. To renounce Judaism was to renounce their own history for many centuries back and step off into what? Were the Ten Commandments, the Psalms, the leadership of Moses and Joshua, the laws, the scriptures, and the prophets, Were all these to be scrapped? How much of this was to be retained and how much was to be rejected? That's a very good question. All of this is still bothering a good many people among us, nearly 2,000 years later. So Peter and the others are not to be blamed for tardiness. The new religion, when they begin to think about it, such had nothing to offer in place of all this except the life and teachings of Christ, as remembered by those about him, and these were not formulated into a canon called the Gospels until Peter and the others had passed from earth. There was no hallowed past. They renounced Judaism, a past stretching all the way back to the mythical Adam. And to crown all this, the new religion was given them as a world religion for their enemies, even these hated Romans, for anybody and everybody, just the same as for the Jews and the Judaized, and no particularity shown for themselves, the elect of their own Hava. Such a thing was unthinkable. It was unheard of in Judaism. Terms of equality with the rest of the world, this writing's getting faint, were simply out of the question. The Jews were till the chosen, and how could they be so impious to Hava as to reject his spiritual favor? So also must have thought the Judaized of Galilee, yet it was the Galileans whose stubborn determination was a determining factor in the spread of Christ's gospel. Religion, race, ethics, patriotism, industrial well-being were all bound up, as they still are, in one indivisible cult called Judaism. There's 2 more pages. Page and a quarter. And if a man renounces one, he renounces all. Hence, the bond of race is compulsory in every other respect. There was but one, the solution as Peter saw it. First became Judaized, then became Christianized. Naturally, he preached first to those already Judaized, hoping thereby the sooner to spread Christianity. Naturally, also he emphasized the points of coincidence between the two rather than the reverse. Peter did not want, nor did he intend to become an apostle to the Gentiles, where his equivocal position would be put to the test. The doctrine of the Messiahship lent itself admirably to his point of view, especially in emphasizing the spiritual deductions of prophets like Isaiah. Peter himself had conformed to the rites of Judaism. Hence the new converts from the Gentile world had only to follow his example, and all would be well. Simple enough, wasn't it? But as to all these different races of mankind, each with its own traditions of what was right or wrong, what common ground could be found among them. Those brought up in Judaism could conceive of ethics and religion as merely as tribal inheritance with no common conscience throughout the world. What could be the basis of a world appeal, therefore, instead of a racial bias? So Peter and others concluded, and they continued to preach Christ and to adhere to the messages of Judaism, disregarding and perhaps unaware to the incongruity therein. Last chapter, abandoning the compromise. But this compromise between Christianity and Judaism, for such it was, could not endure, for the two were unrelated and irreconcilable. Once the one was broadly Gentile, the other was strictly racial and intolerant. Judaism would not have it so. Having brought about the public assassinations of the head of the new faith, they had no idea of permitting his followers to preach his doctrines. They even forbade him to perform acts of healing, and when the disciples persisted, they were thrown into prison. One thing led to another till violence was used at the behest of the Jews. Hiding as usual behind legal authority, the first Christian martyrs fell, and thus the bloody persecutions begun. Meantime, Peter had virtually preached to all in the world on the day of the Pentecost, but it was the same Peter who had to be changed later by a vision. Wow. Okay, that's a lot, folks. A lot to chew on, but that wraps up this reading. So until next time, this is Mike with World News Report, wishing you great blessings. Please like, share, subscribe, and God bless to all. Much love. Mike out.